Today's podcast is about the philosophy of Stoicism, particularly Stoic ethics and their ideas of living the good life. Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium about 300 years before the Common Era. Zeno's successor, Chrysippus, built out the Stoic system more fully. Stoicism later became popular in Rome, and we have writings from the Stoics Seneca, Epictetus, and the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. My guest today is Professor Jula Wildberger, Professor Emerita of Classics at the American University of Paris. So just to start, could you maybe give me a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I'm German. You will hear this very clearly from my wonderful accent, from Frankfurt, Germany, where I live now. And I had the great experience to become a professional classicist, which is a rare thing. And so started working towards my degrees in Germany, then worked a little bit in the UK and London and Glasgow, and finally landed at the American University of Paris, which is a very interesting place because it's a small place where you can do all your crazy things. And there I worked for 70 years and now I'm retired. I've been teaching philosophy, also a little bit of modern philosophy, like philosophy of mind and stuff like that. In my academic career, I started as an expert in the art of love. That's a poem by Ovid, the Ars Amatoria, which I subjected to a critical reading, see whether it works or not. So that was my doctoral thesis, and then for my senior thesis, I moved on. For my habilitation thesis, I moved on to Seneca, really not knowing what I was kind of going into and what would come out of it, and that got me hooked on Stoic philosophy. I started with Seneca because he has a way of writing when you can read Latin well, at least it shoots directly to your heart. It's just something so intense, and I just wanted to engage with those texts. And then I gradually learned more about philosophy and stuff like this. So by training, I'm a klassische Philologin, which means someone who looks at Greek and Latin antiquity from the perspective of the texts and the language. But there are many who start as from the subjects of Latin or ancient Greek that then move on into philosophy in various ways. So we have in Germany, we have partly historians of philosophy who come through the philosophy degree and others who come through the classics degree. And I'm one who came through the classics degree and started as a complete idiot about Stoicism, and then I've been doing this now for more than 20 years and so assimilated that philosophy a little bit and still publishing a little bit just for the fun of it.
Interesting. So we're going to be focusing more on Stoicism. So it's interesting that you came to Stoicism through like the classics and literature as opposed to like from the philosophical angle. Did it, after coming to it through that side, do you feel like it influenced your personal perspective on things or your personal life, or it's more just an academic interest?
I mean, I think it depends on the personality. I'm one of those people who kind of can't do something just in this detached academic ways. For example, when I did Ovid's Ars Amatoria, it also kind of influenced the way I started thinking about love relationships and kind of courtship techniques and stuff like that, applied them even, but only the ones for men. You shouldn't use the ones for women. And similarly, if you read philosophical texts for a long time, you start to conceptualize things differently and refine your concepts, see distinctions, discover false dilemmas and stuff like that. So it shapes your thinking. It also can transform your thinking in ways that are not necessarily good, in that you take over uncritically certain binary distinctions, antitheses like free and enslaved, that probably are not very good to think with. But I can say that Stoicism has shaped my way of thinking, and there are elements of Stoicism that are part of my everyday life, for example, in emotional management.
Okay, so I guess you're saying that like it automatically or like it influenced you from studying it so deeply, even if you don't fully adopt their views.
Yeah. And I didn't realize that this was happening, but again, to mention my late husband, at some point he asked me, at that time I was still smoking, and I did something stupid, I don't know what it was, and he said, "What would Seneca say if he saw you doing this?" And then I started thinking, and what would Seneca say to this or that? I even gave a little talk in Latin on that topic, and so it became a habit to just ask myself in everyday situations, what would Seneca say, or what would be the Stoic way of looking at it. And so then it became conscious reasoning, and at the moment I'm deeply in the phase of the critique where I think about what kind of stupid ideas the Stoics gave me that I need to get out of my system in order to progress in whatever my moral agendas are.
So I guess just to give an overall background, what would you describe as the central ideas of Stoicism, especially in regards to ethics?
So, of course, that is everyone's opinion, what is really a Stoic. I think the key Stoic idea of all the variations is a certain view about human agency in two ways. In one way, that humans have, as far as it is relevant in an axiological sense or moral sense, have complete agency. So we never happen. It's always us doing it when it matters. So I might catch a cold or my hairs can become gray or something. That's not agency. But whatever I'm saying, what I'm thinking, what I'm perceiving, how I am judging, all this is what I do. And I mean, this is a claim that not everyone shared in classical antiquity. And I would say nowadays, most people would say that's no longer true. The more we understand about how the human mind works, there's much where we just happen like events. So the idea is that it is us doing it. In some way, agency is that through which you can conceptualize what is good. I mean, there are other ways. If you think of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which starts, the good is that toward which everything strives. So I would say that it's more or less a commonplace idea in classical antiquity that the good is the point at which motivation is directed. But in the Stoic sense, it is much more limited to saying agency, expertise, being a good agent, building a complete life out of good actions. That is actually what the good is. That is the value that you would want to strive for, and not kind of things that you get or things that happen to you. And
right. I mean, potentially we'll see. We could discuss later whether their view of agency holds up or what exactly their view of agency was. But for now, just in terms of the overall overview. So once they had this position that, it's your agency what matters, where did they go with that? What did they say was the purpose of life, and how could you avoid basically any suffering or things along those lines?
Yeah, so the first thing is they don't really care about avoiding suffering in itself, because then they would be Epicureans.
Right.
Yeah. So we would have to say what suffering means. That in ancient Greek the word is paskein, and it would have similar to the English word suffer two different components. One is the absence of agency. It happens to you and you don't do it. In that the sense, that is definitely something that matters a lot to them. So one of the key ideals is the exousia autopragias, so the license to act for yourself as a rational being, in contrast to a stone, for example, or a plant or so. And in this sense, paskein or suffering is a really bad thing. But if you think of suffering as that which feels bad, that is coincidental, one could say, but not what really is the problem. And here you have to distinguish between the Stoics and the Epicureans. The Epicureans say that the only bad thing is pain, and the good thing is pleasure, which they define as a constant state of absence of pain. So this kind of suffering is not really something a Stoic, if you really want to be a Stoic, you might talk about it, you might sell your ideas with it, but in that sense you would rather become an Epicurean if you say, well, I worry about this because it feels bad. That's really not the problem. Which is again different from, so to say, you could say, an intuition or an experience of you not being okay, not doing the right thing. That's also a sense in which you could say something feels bad. You have a bad feeling when doing that, bad conscience or things like that. So that is a different kind of feeling. But suffering in the sense of that it is painful is indifferent for the Stoics, at least. So it's not really a thing that you would aim at with your philosophy primarily. You can say the Stoic sage will feel better, will have fewer painful experiences, but that's not the reason why you would want to become a Stoic sage.
So if the typical things that many people chase after or try to avoid, they say don't really matter, what do they think should guide someone? Because you could just say, yeah, you should use your agency and your reason, but what are you trying to accomplish? What's their overall goal?
Yeah, and here, so to say, they part ways in many ways. Yeah, so that here we have then different views of what exactly it is what they are aiming for. That there is this idea that of perfection, of a form of flourishing, of becoming really you, which requires agency. But what that means concretely, then again, differs completely. Maybe one way in which you could say how Stoics generally would approach the question is through the theory that, to my view, probably Chrysippos introduced to explain a little better what Zeno had in mind, the theory of oikeiosis, which I like to translate as attachment. So the idea is that nature, and that means God in Chrysippos' version of the theory, makes you disposed to perceive certain things as oikeion, as objects of attachment, as something that belongs to you, and other things as alien, as allotria. And one of the things that you perceive as oikeion is yourself and the way you are put together. In the version that you find in Cicero's De Officiis, for example, it is spelled out rather in a form of rational impulses that the human being, when it grows up and becomes more than just an animal, develops, which is much more substantial. There it is, for example, a sense of beauty and a desire to implement that beauty in their life and in their behavior, or a sense of greatness, one could say, or what they all say, also a sense of a desire to be with other people, sociability. So there are different features that they say the human kind of has, so to say, innately, genetically, or develops in proper ontogenesis. It starts at the birth in a still irrational way, because children are still irrational, and then gradually in ideal ways develops into a certain set of motivations. So that is what drives you to, gives you the benchmarks and the aims for your behavior, for your agency. And agency itself is one of the things that are oikeion, of course, if that makes any sense. So that, I think that's where I would start, that you perceive yourself as a certain kind of being and perceive things as belonging to you or not belonging to you, and that this makes you behave in certain ways. Then virtue is the expertise to behave in these ways most successfully. And that's where the basic definition of the good life as a life in rational agreement with nature, or just in rational agreement, as it's sometimes also said of Zeno, comes from. That says, well, all these original motivations make sense, and you are a certain type of being, and you can become this in such a way that you are consistent with yourself, okay with yourself, and okay with the world around you. And then you have also perfect agency, because there's nothing where you could fail or be hindered. That is, for example, part of the discourse in Epictetus, that you get very much this emphasis on being unhindered, of being always successful.
So just to understand the Stoic position a little more, they kind of, it seems they're saying a person wants to develop themselves and flourish and go after certain inclinations of themselves that kind of lead to fulfillment. But how do they distinguish then? A person has a lot of inclinations that they consider negative. So how do they distinguish between them, which are considered the ones that, oh, this is great and this is in agreement, and the ones that, like, oh no, we actually have to overcome these things?
I mean, Seneca, for example, says this quite clearly. Wisdom consists, and so the good life consists in wanting always the same things and not wanting always the same things. And it says this can only happen if you want the right things. So the Stoics would claim there is a way in which you or I make sense and can make sense. And if we fail to actually do that, kind of be ourselves in the way we are, then it's not a bad inclination or something, one could say, basically, but it's just kind of, we are confused about who we are and what we really want. And this is related to Socrates' idea, which is also called moral intellectualism, that we always only want the good. And if a person is bad or so, it's not that they don't want the right and good thing. It's just that they get confused about what that is. And that is, again, connected to this specific idea of Stoic agency, that at least, so to say, the so-called orthodox Stoic view would say that in principle, there is nothing in your mind, nothing anywhere in you that would drive you to do something that is against, so to say, this harmonious motivational set that you have from your attachment. So it's not that we, as Becker, for example, would have said, we are in a way born for disagreement and we can only try to optimize agency. The idea is really we are born for rational agreement. And of course, it is clear that this is also a theological and metaphysical claim, that to say this is a world in which a beneficent God has made us such that we can be like that. And God does not give us any unsurmountable motivations or whatever. I mean, the Stoics differ in the way they talk about these bad inclinations, like you're kind of disposed to become victim to some addiction because you have really strong cravings or so. Later Stoics would say that this can, or some Stoics might even say that some unlucky people have this to such a degree that they can't master it, or most people would have to work really hard, but they wouldn't say that this is a natural attachment. This is then a malfunction.
Okay, that's interesting, since it seems that people naturally have all sorts of negative inclinations, like getting angry and getting worried and all these things. So they try to say all of those are just not what's considered natural.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the big discussions. If you want to read up more about this, you can read this in Cicero's Tusculanae Disputationes, and, for example, in Seneca's De Ira in the first book, or also he has written a letter about it. So Stoics would right out claim that these inclinations are not natural. They are unnatural. So they would say, for example, I don't know, so there is going back to Plato, a distinction between different parts of the soul, the reasoning part, the tumoides, which is, so to say, the aggressive aggressive part, in the sense also of an energy and the push to do things, and then you have the desirous part, the epitemotikon. And Plato, famously in the Republic, for example, he has this guy who kind of gets into all kinds of conflicts, angry with himself, saying I should be just, but driven by his desire. So Plato and also Aristotle would say that here there are these features in our mind, and they are natural. They belong to the innate makeup of humans, where you really have bad inclinations or bad drives, or you really can get into conflict with yourself, in a real conflict. The Stoics would always say, later Stoics, Posidonius, for example, we find that also in Seneca's On Anger, you find that partly, that you would say that people are more disposed to this, and that they are also, so to say, certain functionings in the human mind, like that you have a certain type, kind of aggressiveness or this sense of greatness. And then you can say there is something natural there that can be distorted. So, for example, it's perfectly natural that you desire food or drink or something, but it can then be distorted and can be perverted or go wrong because of our rational faculties, that we tell ourselves this is really the good thing, this is really what I want. I need to have this cigarette or whatever it is, when this is just our intellectual confusion.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about that, I guess, is I would think somebody is born, they're not, born perfect, but if everything according to nature is great, then it would seem that they should be born perfect. But it seems like actually it's very difficult to reach the ideal of a Stoic sage. So what are they striving for that whole time?
Yeah, so the problem is what I said, this perversion or twisting, one could also say, this idea of diastrophe. Which means we have two ways in particular in which we tend to get confused according to the Stoics, and one of them is that certain things appear very plausible and we rashly assent to them. So, for example, if you would show me a cone of ice cream, I will very quickly form the opinion that this is something really good that I must have, absolutely. And when I don't think and I don't consider and look at what do I really think a good thing is, then I might have already grabbed the thing and eaten it. And then one can kind of, through these kinds of repeated false choices, create dispositions which then are labeled mental illnesses in a way. We can create dispositions that are harmful. Another way, which is even more difficult for people to resist, is the brainwashing of the many, you could say social influences. So problem is we are living in perverted societies with completely confused and value systems, and right from birth, as you are always told, this is good, this is bad, and usually it's some kind of indifferent or even something of the inverse value that is recommended to you. So that we have a lot of text saying that, and then so you have this idea that there is, so to say, the natural mindset, and your society gives you all kinds of wrong messages which pervert you. Seneca's letter 90 is an example where this is spelled out in some detail, how that happens, the ideal society. The letter is very interesting in the sense that he says these early people who didn't have cultural development, which for him is always also moral corruption, weren't really sages, but they were better people because they weren't subjected to the same kind of social corruption, one could say. And I mean, you see the problem here. On the one hand, there is a very strong claim that, so to say, just from who you are naturally motivated or attached to things, and from this can then develop the mature state of reflective awareness that constitutes proper wisdom. And the social construction of your world, the way that you actually develop as a social being, is more or less an obstacle to all this in many ways. And I mean, that is, of course, a problem because, I mean, we are not these isolated individuals. The question is whether we have any motivations without a social context at all. That's now me as a modern person speaking. But of course, they also see this problem, and also said, on the other hand, there are some things on which all people agree, common notions, for example, that the God exists, or a common idea that a good is something that is always beneficial, and if it ever can be bad for you, then it's not a good, and these kinds of things. So they also think that there is some common agreement by all people, but this then comes through your natural dispositions, which are either innate or develop in you in a natural process and not determined by social variation.
It's potentially another way to look at it, instead of just saying, oh, everything that you feel naturally is good, is that since they were so into reason, maybe if you always let your reason determine things, then that'll be good. But if you let, various drives determine things, then that could be bad. Is that like another way to look at it?
That's exactly what they reject. But generally, you could say that in an adult human being, everything is rational. Your stupidest behavior, everything is rational, apart from kind of you're being drugged with something, like completely intoxicated or so, and you have some kind of hallucination or stuff like that. Even your most raving rage is a rational mental state that no being without reason could have. So that there is this irrational drive that makes you do something and reason corrects it. That's not their way of thinking. Everything is rational. So they have this monism, psychological monism, which is very important for Stoicism.
So why would they say that getting angry is wrong then, if it is rational?
Yeah, that's the thing. A rational being can do very stupid stuff, and even worse stuff than a mere animal that might be you provoke a dog and the dog would rush at you, but then it's okay. A human will kind of have all kinds of opinions, will exceed the behavior, will be inconsistent, will become pointless, will. So, and anger generally is wrong. So the Stoics say you shouldn't be angry ever, and they have a detailed explanation why that is so, which I could tell you if you're interested.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just as an example, you can maybe give it over in brief, just as an example of how they view things as being wrong.
Okay, idea is, so anger is presupposes that you think some wrong has been done to you. Someone has harmed you unjustly, and no one can harm you. No one can harm you, and part of yourself. That's the nature of evil. So if I kill you, if I take away all your possessions, then this is inconvenient for you. but it's not harm in the proper sense. So a wise person cannot be harmed by anyone because agency is the only good. The only harm that can happen to you is that there's something wrong with your agency. And that is completely in your control because of this idea that we are masters of our agency. So Epictetus, for example, talks about this quite often. The dichotomy of control belongs to this idea. So what I judge, what I want, what I desire, what I move away from, all this is in my control. And very important here is to see that agency doesn't mean, so to say, the physical movement, the implementation, the carrying out of the process. It is the mental act of agency. For example, say I raise my hand. What happens here is that inside I have an idea. It suits me right now to raise my hand. I assent to this idea, and as long as I assent it, my hand is up. If now someone comes and holds my hand down and I can't do that, I still have acted if I have given that assent to this idea. So this is the agency, and there is no external being, not even, as Epictetus says, God himself, who can do that for you or make you do that if you don't do it yourself. And so a sage cannot be harmed, and so the things about which people become angry are things that are not harmful. And therefore, you start with a wrong judgment. And then you have another judgment that you should behave like a mad person because of that. Which doesn't mean, like, for example, you shouldn't defend yourself or you shouldn't take measures to punish a person if that is appropriate and so on. Protecting people that are dear to you if someone attacks them, but you shouldn't have this false judgment. An injustice has happened. I need to punish someone. Absolutely, without reserve. So that is these are the basic ideas that you will make wrong judgments about what is really going on, and as a consequence also tend to behave in ways that are not eulogos, not well reasoned. So you commit all kinds of bad actions that are actually harmful. So you harm yourself by being angry, by having judgments that are wrong, because assenting to something false, if you do that deliberately, then you harm yourself, because that is a form of bad cognitive action. So the emotion of anger is, so it might be that you kind of feel a little bit like something happens, like this feeling like your throat is swelling or something like this, or you have a rush. You could say, well, that might be a eupatheiai, a non-voluntary state of arousal, but then from this forming judgments and assenting to them which are false, that is just self-harm and completely wrong. So anger in this sense of the Stoic emotion, which always implies a false judgment about something that appears as good but isn't, or appears as bad but isn't, and the idea that it is appropriate to get aroused about this thing as if it were really good or as if it were really bad. That is the harm and not the emotion.
So I guess a way to put it would be that a lot of things people do that are wrong are just based on false and incorrect evaluations, such as thinking that the external world matters. And if people would recognize that basically all that matters is their own decisions and agency, then they just, they wouldn't get angry, and a lot of other negative emotions they just wouldn't have.
It depends on what you mean by matters. So there is also a theory attributed, for example, to the so-called renegade Stoic Ariston of Chios, that or often associated with cynicism, that only virtue, so this excellence of agency or moral excellence, the optimal state of your own mind, is what matters, and everything is completely irrelevant. The Stoics do think that there are things that matter, and matter quite a lot, namely the so-called indifferents, which aren't good and bad. And the emotion that I'm talking about, which we like anger, for example, which are about what appears to be good and bad, are not about, often arise when it's actually just an indifferent, and that is the problem. But the indifferents themselves do have context sensitive value or natural value, for example, health health, or that you would want your children to be healthy and live and be well fed, or sociability in all kinds of ways. So there are many things that the Stoics say have value, and it is rational in your agency to take account of this. One phrase that is used here is that all these objects which tend to be external, they don't need to be external. For example, intelligence would also be an indifferent, or that you have keen senses. That's also mentioned as an indifference. So these things are also indifferent because they aren't goods or bads, but it is rational to take these things and evaluate them correctly, because that's what rational agency consists in. So one phrase already attributed to Chrysippus is that it's kind of the material with which virtue as an artist of life builds its artwork of a good life. I would say matters in the sense of that you take it as a good or a bad if it isn't. And a good or bad is only that thing that is, so to say, an aspect of our agency. So if you make the distinction there, then I would say, yeah, it shouldn't matter. But if you say matter in the sense of it has some kind of value, natural value, even not just kind of conventional value, but natural value, then I would say there are things that matter. These indifferent because they are neither good nor bad, but they can be preferred or dispreferred. That is a term, as they are often translated. So some have more value than other things, or more negative value. So life is a preferred indifferent and death is a dispreferred indifferent, for example.
So this idea basically that the preferred indifferents are ways for a person to be virtuous, but if they don't get the preferred indifferent, then at that point it just doesn't matter.
Yeah. So not doing the rational. So rational behavior would say you aim to be healthy. There's a famous passage in Chrysippus quoted by Epictetus. Of Chrysippus we have no complete works. We have just quotes here. There where he says, as long as I don't know what fate has decreed for me or what is fated for me, I will strive to be healthy because nature has made me disposed to seek health. The idea is that's what I'm attached to. I'm attached to my formation, to me, what I am, and the perception of myself, and that I perceive myself in a good state, and that includes health, of course. And I take this as a benchmark or as a guidance in rational agencies that I say, yeah, so these are the kinds of things I'm disposed to take, so usually it's okay that I take them. And there are other things that I experience as alien, as allotria, and usually I avoid them, like getting sick. And he says, but if I know what God wants, for example, I figure out, so no, of course, I got cancer, I have it now, yeah, and it's one of those versions that cannot be treated, then I want that because I know God has made this best possible world and this is part of the plan. That is now what is my thing, and now I embrace it. And I wouldn't struggle against this because it's not a good or bad thing. The good or bad thing is then how do I deal with this indifferent as I encounter it, and what do I do with him? What kind of artwork do I form out of it? So this is again this idea of materia virtutum. But as we find in Cicero's De Finibus, for example, where Cicero discusses these questions a lot, is that Chrysippus insisted on, and other Stoics too insisted on, we need to have these categories of indifference precisely because we want to live rationally. And if everything is equivalent and doesn't make any difference at all, how can you act rationally? And this rationality comes from the understanding of who you are, or how you are attached, which properties you have, and of your environment, and especially also for Chrysippus, very much understanding of the world as the creation of a benevolent rational, sociable God.
So I guess one way to look at it is the preferred indifference seem to be what one should want, but whatever happens shows that that's actually ideal, because now that it's happened, they view that as everything that happens is according to the divine order.
So the difference between goods and bads on the one hand, and the indifference on the other hand, is that the value of goods and bads is bad is always negative. It's always harmful. It's never in any way something that would never have any rational reason to take it. The good is always beneficial. There can be no question if a good comes your way, and there can't be any conflict even. Yeah? So that is the nature of the good. That is, so to say, the basic conception of the good, or the Stoic definition, that it is ophelia kai uk heteron ophelia. So it's benefit and nothing but benefit, and the bad is harm and nothing else but harm. Whereas indifferents do have partly a natural value, but like you are attached to them since birth, like your life, that you are alive. But all these indifferent values are indifferent in the sense that none of them is necessary for you to attain the good life. For the good life, you only need to have the goods and not the indifference. That also their value is context sensitive, which means that according to context, what would be usually valuable might not be valuable in another instance. I mean, there are tons of examples of that. Like Aristotle, for example, says, usually we want to be healthy, but now all healthy people are recruited by an evil tyrant, and they have to serve the tyrant, and then the tyrant is deposed, and all those who have served him are put to death. So you were lucky when you got sick, because that meant that you could survive. And so there might just in real life, there might be situations where, or you have different options, and one thing that usually you would take, you don't take it here because you can get something else. So for example, say my life or the life of a person I care about, then maybe the life of the person is the one that I would prefer in this context, and usually, while in another context, I would prefer my own life. So they don't have a stable value that is always correct. And in an extreme form, you can say, if you believe, like Chrysippus, that the world is providentially ordered, and that everything happens to the best possible plan and most rationally, which is something that Zeno writes about Chrysippus. So it's actually those Stoics who also have metaphysics with their ethics actually agree on these points. You would say, I have just this local perspective. I don't really know what's going on everywhere, and I need to accept that some things happen without me knowing why exactly they happen. That is actually a definition of tyche, or fortunes, the chance events. So nothing happens randomly in the world, but there are some things where we humans don't know why they happen. But what you can say by default, if it happens, God wanted it to happen this way. And he wanted it because he wanted to make this world optimal, the best possible world, and he made it out of benevolence. So it must be good. And then I turn this thing, even the most horrible thing, into a good by accepting it, embracing it, and maybe I can even sometimes understand why it happens, even if it's disadvantageous for me if I just take my personal, narrow, local perspective. But sometimes I can't even say that, and still I know this is what it is. But the key things, the goods, the Stoics say, we do have them always if we want to, if we don't confuse ourselves. So this is this key idea. Because again, going back to the agency, because harm comes only from your own agency. God doesn't do you any harm. And Epictetus, for example, in a very beautiful discourse 1:6 on providence, talks about we need two things to be able to react properly to providence, and they are, so to say, prerequisites of happiness. The one thing is the ability to be grateful, and the other is the ability to see what's going on and what we have actually got. And that makes it rational to say, if something happens and I don't really know what it is, and it would be a dispreferred indifferent for me, but it somehow must fit into the plan. Who am I to know everything? So I embrace it and say, still, there is nothing that can really harm me, because I still have, as Epictetus would say, my prohairesis, or I have my judgment, I have the ability to be virtuous. And if I start kind of complaining about what happens and have emotions with false judgments, then I'm actually harming myself and forsaking the gift that I've received as a rational being.
So the Stoics had this whole view of how someone should live, and they seem to have a different take on emotions. So I wanted to discuss a little, what was the ideal Stoic view on emotions and the emotions a person should feel?
Okay, so as I said before, emotions or those that they are interested in mostly are actions. I think I need to clarify here the term emotion, because emotion for us is a very wide field of mental states, a wide range of mental states. And the Stoics also, I think we don't really have a text that explicitly discusses this, but it might also be sensations with a valence like toothache. So feelings in the sense that something hurts or so. Or Seneca discusses that also sages shed tears so that you have a certain kind of painful or also pleasurable mental states that are not emotions in the sense that that would be interesting for us here, because that are things that are not voluntary. They are not actions. They are also morally irrelevant. Yeah, that is like being well fed or going hungry or something like that. They also explicitly talk that there are certain non-voluntary first reactions, like for example a sudden noise, and you so have this kind of shock moment. We don't have a lot of text about this, and it's not really clear whether there's only one type of that or another. The important thing is that these are all, again, reactions that do not involve any judgment. And the other Stoics say, well, that is just like we are susceptible to pain, or that we are mortal and we can't do anything about it. So these reactions. So maybe some would also say that you could maybe desensitize to certain things, and some might connect it more to the things that happen in an animal mind. You can train animals to, like for example, police horses will not be so afraid of sounds. That's not a rational, would not be a rational judgment. Seneca also gives the example of a military horse that kind of hears the sound of the war trumpet and gets aroused, so to say, mentally prepares for battle. But he would say all these, again, we would call these emotional states, and I think the Stoics would also say it's a kind of an emotional state, but it is not agency, since it is involuntary and it's morally irrelevant, inevitable, but no harm, no benefit in the proper sense. And then there are the passions, as I call them, the patheiai, which consists of are constituted by judgments. So that we also have variation, but a key idea would be that these passions are constituted, or at least determined, by judgments that are false. What is very important to know here, that these judgments are two. One is just, one could say, a judgment of moral fact, that you identify something and say this is bad or this is good. And then connected to this, there are psychic movements, which it's very important to know them. For example, when you read Epictetus, there are certain types of very strong movements appropriate for something good or bad. And the second judgment is to perform this movement, which in those cases where you have a passion is excessive and irrational, not in the sense that it wouldn't be a function of reason, so the mental capacity of reason. It is a rational judgment, but it is irrational in the sense that it's a very stupid idea. You can only have stupid ideas if you can think in the first place. So it's thinking and acting or based on your thinking, discursive thinking, but it's stupid. So these are the passions. And then we have another category of emotions. Frequently we mentioned sages, since they never make false judgments, don't have this kind of emotion, the passion, the patheiai. They always know what is good and bad, and they wouldn't confuse something good and something bad with something that isn't. And they are also always able to conceive the right kind of impulse movement, as it is called, hormé, appropriate to the object or the target that is to be attained with that impulse. Now, it's clear that sages do not have contractions, because all good and bad is just what in our power, and a sage being a rational, reasonable person. So a sage will never make any judgment that will harm them, so they will never have any bad. And so they also don't have this contraction. Margaret Graver translates this as distress. This would be all kinds of this irrational sadnesses or mental pains that are irrational. So these are basic impulses, categories of impulses. So these are these four key emotion impulses with regard to the perceived good and the perceived bad. And that is what is mostly talked about in our sources and then also discussed in modern Stoics. I do think that there are also other emotions that really don't get talked about so much, like, for example, the love for children. When a sage has a child, the child is not a good because it's not an action, not something the sage makes. It's a highly preferred indifferent. And if you love that child, one would assume that this also was understood by the Stoics as some kind of an emotional thing. So action and so also the emotions consist of this impulse, this horme, and the cognitive component of a judgment that coincides with this horme and is agreed to with the so-called syntaxis when you judge, yes, this is what I want to do. And so these are these impulses like the orexis and the eclysis. And I would suppose that also ordinary impulses like I want to embrace this child, or I want my child to live, or just the kind of impulse you have when you see the child coming into the room, or so, that Stoics would also say that this is in some way emotional, but we don't really have any elaborate discussion of that, so it's really hard to say what exactly they thought and to which degree they actually went into these questions. So for the discussion of Stoic emotions, the one thing is that this distinction between these kind of involuntary spontaneous reactions that aren't really actions but, so to say, subpersonal functions, one could almost say. And then you have the emotion that is also an action, and there in particular the passion. That is the big problem of the fool. And as long as you have passions, you cannot have the good life. So eupatheiai, the lack of these passions or the absence of these passions, is concomitant to sagehood. It's, I would say, an essential feature in the sense you can't be a sage and have passions, but it is not in this sense. You could also say it's a necessary condition for sagehood that you get rid of these things, but it doesn't in itself constitute the good life, I would say.
So basically the Stoics recognize there's like immediate reactions that a person can't control, and then those are basically just neutral. And then the passions they're just against, or meaning a sage shouldn't have them. So besides the immediate reaction, what's left for the sage? And they don't have those contractions. So they have some kind of expansion, but when do they feel those? Like, how does it connect with what we call emotions? When are they feeling those longer-term
for example,
positive emotions?
a sage is constantly aware that they are in the possession of virtue, that they are virtue in a way. They embody virtue, that does something and knows this is a good action, which is a good thing. So the sage constantly has goods. So constantly a sage would be elated, rationally elated. And
it just wouldn't be dependent on anything external. It would just be this like constant state.
Yeah, because it's the goods are these good is virtue and nothing else but virtue, benefit and nothing but virtue. So it can also be things that are connected to it. So, for example, a good is also if two sages meet, then the other person is also a good thing because it's nothing but else but virtue. Yeah. So one can also be elated about the presence of one's friend, and so sages in this sense are constantly in a state of reasonable, intense emotions, which are called probably eupatheiai. We also find the term eupatheiai. So the sense is they are not crazed out. They are not just kind of out of control and what we often connect with emotionality. But these emotions are deep and stable and appropriate to what's actually going on and very positive. Of course, there's also the emotion of caution, which means that the sage avoids to do anything that would be unreasonable, not eulogon, so do a bad act, like make a false judgment or something like this. And there is another important idea here. Excitus is an impulse with reservation, meaning it's reasonable to go for this, provided it doesn't turn out that circumstances show that I was wrong in making this decision, circumstances I do not know now, or that it, like, for example, when Chrysippus says, I do everything I can do to stay healthy, but if I realize that I get sick, then this is the thing that I'm embracing. So he wouldn't seek health like a good, but with a reservation, provided it is really in agreement with the world as a whole, and provided no facts turn out that show me that God has different ideas than I have, for example. So the problem with passions is, independent of how exactly one understands, is again this lack of reservation. This idea that you absolutely must have it, and well, it seems like this is the reasonable thing to do now, and so I'm going for it. But I keep attentive to circumstances and see so that I can change plans. And that is the sense in which the sage is never hindered or never fails in their endeavor, because sages always have this reservation in place when it's something that is not in their control. And so they cannot be disappointed, they cannot fail, because failure is part of the plan.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's kind of like a number of parallels, I think, between like Stoicism and Buddhism. So one that's relevant here, I guess, is in Buddhism, they have this idea of the two arrows, where when something happens to a person, there's the first arrow that kind of like the immediate pain or the immediate reaction that they can't control. And then there's the second arrow of suffering that comes from how they think about it and how they perceive it. So I wonder if that has some parallel with here. They have this immediate impulse, the Stoics say, that can't be controlled, but then afterwards, like they kind of do have control over it. And that's something where basically they're against any passion. I feel like, I don't know if it's exactly the same, but it seems somewhat similar.
I mean, of course, it sounds like a similar idea. I do not know enough about Buddhism to say in which sense it is similar or not. Generally, the Stoics would say that a passion starts quickly. So these involuntary reactions are quick to happen, and then it doesn't take a long time to have your passion judgment. So you need to kind of form that rational impression. It can also be that it happens, so to say, in parallel. Like, for example, I hear a sudden sound, and then still my heart rate might be up, but I'm already judging it's not a danger, but still I have some kind of thumping heart or trembling or whatever.
Yeah, something else I wanted to discuss is how modern Stoicism, which has become more popular recently, in what ways are they aligned with ancient Stoicism of the Greeks and Romans, and in what ways are they different, and maybe how are they different in ways that they acknowledge or they don't acknowledge? It's just an interesting topic.
I mean, I've looked a little bit at this subject, and one thing that is very clear is that you can't say there is the one way in which people nowadays do Stoicism. It's rather, you could say, what would you count as Stoicism or not? So what they all have in common, that it's somehow about agency and emotional control. And those people who seriously engage with Stoicism also understand what agency means here, because there's this misunderstanding that you say, well, like with much self-help literature, yeah, so become a Stoic and you will be successful all your life, you will make a lot of money or whatever it is. So the promise of Stoicism is that with this idea of agency, that you can really do something about the problems you have and kind of assume agency and control in some way. So it is very attractive for people who are in some way in a situation of helplessness or perceived helplessness or real helplessness. You feel overwhelmed by things. And I mean, I think that is also one of the strengths of the Stoic theory of emotions, that it considers that it's not just something that happens to you, but it's something that you are doing. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why that in particular is interesting for people. And I think the rest then comes with that first interesting idea, because it's actually something that can be applied even if you don't agree with the Stoics that you have absolute agency. You can still say, I can do something about it at least. And it doesn't necessarily require all the metaphysical implications or that we agree on all moral points and so on. So I think that that is the thing that most forms of Stoicism nowadays have in common. That's why I also would call them Stoicism. And then there are different ways how they deal with it and what else one takes from Stoicism. Increasingly, in those who kind of take Stoicism really seriously, in the sense of they really read stuff, they really research, they practice and exercise, and also go to the more difficult texts and stuff like that. I think they generally tend to care more about this other aspect of Stoicism, namely that it is also a philosophy that highlights the sociability of human beings and also sees the world as a place of sociability, coming from the divine as well, if they also take the metaphysical thing. So sociability becomes very important there too. And that's something that struck me when I looked at Stoics on the internet. I mean, one disregards those people somehow having a problem with their masculinity. Usually they tend to be really nice and respectful with each other.
Interesting. So basically the idea of agency you think carries over well in like modern Stoicism. And then there's this idea of sociability that some emphasize. Is that very connected with the Stoic idea of virtue?
Sociability, I think, is part of Stoic virtues in the sense that you can see whichever Stoic you read, they will always pay particular attention to social virtues like justice. If you read, for example, Cicero's De Officiis, which is in the first two books based on a work by Panaitius, you can clearly see that a big emphasis is placed on virtues that involve some kind of social behavior, and even those that are not, like justice, directly the virtue of sociability or connected to interpersonal relations. It still turns out to be conceived of the version of a sociable person. But my understanding is that sociability is actually a basic property of human beings, just as rationality in the ancient Stoic thought. Here I'm a little bit an outlier. I haven't read much which say that it is otherwise, but sociability is a property of God too. And so sociability and rationality belong together. These are two key properties of God, of the active principle God, and of humans, because they are more godlike than animals or plants or stones, for example. So it's just seen as a core ingredient. And you find many Stoic texts that think there is Zeno, for example, the founder, wrote a text that you can say that's the first clear expression of something like cosmopolitanism, that we all should live together under a common law, on like a herd, on a common pasture. If you're Seneca or Marcus Aurelius or also Epictetus, they always enhance this the sociability, both as a virtue but also as what makes humans humans. And that if you are not, that's also one of the reasons why Seneca thinks that anger is absolutely wrong, because there's nothing that is less sociable than anger. And it's contrary to the sociable human nature to desire to do something bad to someone else. So I would say sociability in the ancient Stoic discourse is very important. I mean, Epicureans in other ways have a practice of friendship. And I mean, Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics writes also very strongly about philia and has a lot to say about friendship. But I would still say, if you read Marcus Aurelius or Seneca or Epictetus, it's just amazing how much they enhance human sociability and how we belong together. Marcus Aurelius, for example, and don't forget, he was the Roman emperor, right? He was the most powerful man in the world. If he wanted someone killed, he got him killed. And he talks about how humans belong together and uses the example of teeth, the two rows of teeth. So a human alone is useless. We are like the teeth. What would you do with the lower row of teeth if you don't have the upper row of teeth to bite and to chew?
Right. I think he also
it's
he
so
does also
incredibly
complain
modest.
a lot. Yeah, no, I was just saying, like, he praises people. I think he also complains a lot about people.
Yeah. I mean, Marcus Aurelius, but again, you can see this was a very personal text. It was definitely not made for publication. This was his personal notebook, diary, or whatever, where he wrote things. And definitely I would say he had a strong people problem. At least it doesn't come across that there are many people around him whom he likes a lot. He has this first book in the Proseuton and to himself in this book, where he talks about what he has gotten from people, usually something he admires, and them might also be something they've done for him. So he could appreciate people and what they've done. But if you read the text, you will sometimes feel, oh man, he seems to hate everyone. You're absolutely right. But you could also say, I mean, this was probably dealing with his negative feelings rather than I mean, he wouldn't have to encourage himself to love. But there's sometimes he writes he really would want to be really cherishing people, philos dorgos, so really cherish people as he should. So but that makes it even more striking that he doesn't have the inclination, maybe, if you read these texts. I mean, we don't know him personally. We don't know how selective this is. Maybe someone edited out when the thing was made public, where people were actually named in order so not to make anyone envious. But let's say the impression one gets in this text is that someone really, really thinks that he is part of a community, then that he belongs together with all other humans, and that he should love them and care for them and do right by them, even though he doesn't really feel like doing it. They hates them, maybe they get on his nerves. I don't know. I never was Roman emperor, so it's also difficult to say what your experiences are when you're in this position and everyone is kind of doing their thing and getting on your nerves, maybe also because there's a lot to be had from you, or people are also afraid, or flattery. It might be a little bit more difficult to have real good relationships when you're in such a social position.
How well do you think Stoicism works nowadays? If from a modern perspective, maybe even a non-religious perspective. So they don't take certainly their assumptions on physics and very likely different views on theology and all those things. Does the ethics stand up? Does it still stand independently, their ethical view, or are they too intertwined with each other?
I would say Stoicism itself says, a key idea of Stoicism is that catalepsis, that you have certain perceptions of what is indeed the case, and that you should only agree to these. I mentioned, and if you don't do that, then you can never become a sage. So I think that is one of the problems nowadays, that our conceptions of truth, for good reason, are no longer this kind of correspondence conception of truth. We do not have facts like they have, but still, and I mean, that is something that many Stoics in this. I've written a paper in which I explain a little bit that there are people nowadays who in some sense could be called Stoics or call themselves Stoics, do not embrace this idea. But one could say that Stoicism would mean a commitment to facts, and that means also well-informed commitment to facts. And then there is the question, I mean, the world they knew is very different from the world that we know. On the other hand, you can also say that there are some examples where you can show how the Stoics actually disregarded known scientific facts. For example, their theory of the mind being in the heart, a little ball of fire, so to speak, presupposes an idea that the arteries were actually filled with air, and they just maintained these ideas and didn't change that. Galen wrote a big treatise in which he actually over 2 books lambasts the Stoics for thinking that, because they thought they didn't really understand what the brain was doing. And of course also their physics. And so in many ways you can say, I mean, our facts are different from the Stoic facts, and the Stoic philosophical system is based on a different reality from ours. I find it very difficult to say that you could actually have a theory like Chrysippus' with the facts we have now. And I would say not only because of what we know about the functioning of the brain, or also what we've learned about the workings of the psychology in various ways. Also, what I feel is where we have come to a much more complex understanding of social mechanisms and the ways our cognition, our minds are socially embedded and shaped by society, not in the sense of just as distortion, but of being constituted by it. For example, how a sense of self is created and modifies through the interaction with of a little child and the care persons. I mean, there's just so much more, including also a different scientific methodology these guys didn't have the same methodology of ascertaining facts. Certain things we have learned how we can avoid error, they didn't yet know. And so in this sense, the Stoic system nowadays cannot work. And I would say in particular also that many of the problems in some of the Stoics come from so to say, the societies they were living in. And these societies were really horrible. These were slave societies. These were highly hierarchical patriarchies. And you can't just be acculturated in this without any serious critique of your own system and the mindset that you get from it, and just succeed in the philosophy that you want to do. So I've been researching a little bit on how Seneca actually fails to achieve this sociability he aims for, because of the social paradigms he lives in, his prejudices, his social role, his sense of social identity, and the concepts he lives with, like kind of destroy what he actually wants to achieve. So in this sense, I think Stoicism itself cannot work. But of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't good ideas you can work with. And I think in general, for example, the application of Stoicism in cognitive behavioral theory, I don't think that I have the exousia autopragias. I don't think that I, in the sense as we usually think of agency, do that. And not even in the sense of how Chrysippos might have thought that I don't think I have agency. I think I am an event. But that's not how I actually am presented to myself. So the interface that I have is actually one of an agent, and it can be very worthwhile to explore what effect it has to actually see yourself this way and go this road as much as you can.
Well, even the Stoics, they didn't have like a full libertarian view in free will. They had some version of compatibilism. So wouldn't that fit reasonably with how some people view things? Like, I mean, it may not have been exactly like the modern take, but that's overall a common view nowadays. Wouldn't that sort of fit together? So
the fundamental difference is this idea that freedom means that you could have done otherwise. So there are two ways. One is this idea of, well, I could do it, I could not do it. That this is a real possibility. And of course, that is a problem for determinists, because this possibility should not be, because it's determined. Chrysippos worked around this by defining possibility in a different way, in the sense it's in the range of the things that you can do. Yeah. So for example, it is possible if it is in the range of your functions to assent to a proposition or not assent to it. That doesn't mean that in the concrete instance where you assent, you could have not assented. This is causally fully determined, but it is, so to say, in the range of what you could do. The other thing is this kind of causeless spontaneity. Like people, for example, who think of quantum theory as a solution to the free will problem, that it kind of somehow spontaneously happens in this moment without a causal history leading to what is happening. And that is the Chryssippian determinism, means that you have a causal history. Everything happens by antecedent causes, and causes have exactly the effect they have. So that you have, so to say, a chain of causation or network, and stretching both simultaneously and also in the past and the present. And this network is fixed and repeats even in world circles. And Chrysippos' answer then is compatibilism means in this network there's also me, and I'm the cause of my actions. So I'm the determinant cause of what I do. And I mean, some people accept this or not. I have no problem with that in principle, but I don't believe that I have freedom. So that's why I don't have a problem with it. But I think this definition of agency makes sense in the sense that you are with certain mental functions, which are just what kind of cause you are. If you have the say agency as I am this kind of cause that acts in this way with these ranges of possibilities, and that's what I call agency, then it makes actually sense. But I don't even believe that, because I'm a physicalist.
Okay. And I guess a question overall would be, in practice, how effective is Stoicism? Like if someone says like, oh, they don't, the external doesn't matter, just their own virtue, and is that something that works in practice, like when people follow that, or could it cause them to maybe end up not being as incentivized to accomplish things, even though they still believed in preferred indifference and all that, it could have that result.
I wouldn't make a general recommendation. So Tim Le Bon of Modern Stoicism does research. There's an organization called Modern Stoicism. They have a website, and there you can find this research, and others research it too, that say that that's psychological research, embracing certain practices, Stoic therapeutics, so to speak, may have an effect. I would definitely say that a sense of agency, whether it's real or just the way you perceive yourself, is always something that I don't have the research, and I'm not a psychologist, so I can't say, but it seems to me that it's something that makes it easier to deal with in difficult situations. So this idea that you have some kind of say in what's going on, and that it is very hard for people to feel out of control. And it is so that our life, of course, imposes all kinds of situations on us where we do not have control. We lose people we love. We aim for something and we don't reach it. You apply for a job and you don't get it, or you have a project and it fails. I want to write this wonderful paper and I realize, it was a bad idea. I shouldn't have even started writing. That happens all the time. I think the Stoic psychology, or the way of describing the person, or encouraging us to experience ourselves as such, can be helpful to kind of have a take on things that makes it kind of easier to deal with. When you have serious mental problems, you should see someone who is an expert in treating mental health problems. If you're just kind of trying out things, how to deal with your life, maybe it's something you would like to deal. I wouldn't generalize. I can say what it is for me. Thinking in terms of what is good and what is indifferent, even if goodism might not necessarily be in exactly what the Stoics mean, often helps me in situations to kind of stop and see, how do I really evaluate this? The idea, even knowing that I'm just happening, right? But I function in such a way that I'm telling myself all the time that I'm an agent and I am the mistress of my universe, so to speak. Kind of also helps sometimes to kind of not get lost in your emotions. And I don't have the same reasons why I have moral commitments, and my moral commitments are also different. But I think generally saying if something feels bad doesn't necessarily mean that it is bad. And that is more about being good or doing something good than how it feels. That is also a way of thinking about things that I find practically applicable. But generally in ethics, I do not have that powerful meta-ethics where I could say, well, I know what is right and what is wrong, and I have the key argument to prove to you this is how it should be. Stoic philosophy is eudaimonistic in the sense that it's not like modern deontology, which is about obligation and doing the right thing. So it's about how can you live the good life, which is not necessarily the same as a virtue ethic in the sense of how can I be a good person. It involves that too. So they have thought a lot about how can I have a good life, whatever that might mean. So engaging with their ideas and doing so critically, and not forgetting that they were just guys like us who lived at a time knowing different things, lived in a society that had really horrible flaws, like our society has flaws. And you can also learn from that, where people kind of don't see that something is utterly wrong in what they are saying or thinking. And then they say, well, maybe there's something that's utterly wrong like that in my thinking too, and I don't see it because I'm embedded in a different type of society. But I would say, engaging with this thought and also kind of finding a community with whom you can reason about these things, which you can find when you practice Stoicism today. Why not? I think it's probably good for many people. And I have a great respect for those people who seriously do this. When I look on the subreddit Stoicism, I'm not often there, but if someone poses a question, the answers are really thoughtful. And it's also a way of a community, and you have to start at some point. I think the problem is if you make it a new religion and you say everything that Marcus Aurelius says is brilliant and needs to be followed to the letter, so I would take it as a starting point and not as some kind of commitment. The Church of Epictetus or something. That's I think a quote from Tom Wolfe's a novel, A Man in Full. So if you do it with a critical eye, I think it can do good, and I do it all the time, honestly. And I'm not a Stoic.
Okay. So one more related question, I guess, is just the Stoics, it seemed like they very much didn't want to be vulnerable. They wanted, no matter what the external circumstances, that they should feel good or happy or whatever, have that flourishing. But it seems in the real world, people often do want to go along with the ups and downs. So even like on a trivial level, like if someone's at a sports game, they get very into rooting for a team. And if they don't have a team to root for, they'll get bored, even though that's making them vulnerable if their team loses. So the Stoics would say, like, you shouldn't care, like, even about much bigger things than that. You shouldn't care about certainly such small things. You shouldn't get like too emotionally invested in. So is it just that they were coming from a different preference? Would there be a claim that, most people are just wrong about what makes them happy? Or it's just like a different moral choice how to view the world? Like maybe the Stoics would say that, yeah, these people are just misguided, and if they learned the true way, then they would be happier overall. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think so. There's a real problem there that these ancient eudaimonistic ethics, for some reason or other, felt that they had, or some of them, the Epicureans too, but the Stoics were the most extreme, and it's a criticism raised against them already in classical antiquity that they kind of overpromise and dehumanize people in taking away their vulnerability. And I mean, there are big problems to that. Martha Nussbaum, for example, in her critique of the Stoics, points out that this also means that you can easily get callous about the real harm done to people if you say that it's just indifferent. Yeah, but I mean that is something that has come up often. If it's about having a richer emotional life, I wouldn't say that this is really a problem if you think about how Seneca talks about the emotion he has towards friends and family and how he talks about grief. I think certainly, as long as it is not a passion, as long as you realize it's not truly the bad thing, you can have actually a very rich emotional life. I mean, most people who root for a sports team would not say that's as bad as losing their child to a painful cancer. And then you could think of, say, becoming an evil person, which would maybe be even worse than that. It just shows you, then you can root for a sports team, but still you understand that's not the real bad. And so it seems that we have these intuitions too. And so if you don't have this ideal that the Stoic can only have these wise emotions towards goods and evils and has no other feelings whatsoever, which I don't think is anywhere stated in the sources, then you can actually have a rich emotional life and care for many things. Only you always remember what is good, but what is really bad and what is really good.
Okay.
Doesn't mean that is always in your control, as Epictetus would say, or other Stoics.
Okay, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome.